This is Dr.RED Panda.
Did George Washington really live up to the greatness described in textbooks? Are you aware of his lesser-known dark history? I'm Dr. Red Panda, and in this episode, let's take a more comprehensive look at the darker side of America's founding father, George Washington. George Washington, the slave owner. Firstly, George Washington came from a well-off background. At the age of 11, he inherited 4 slaves from his family. Later, he pursued a wealthy widow and married her, even accepting responsibility for her 2 children. By the time of their marriage, he owned at least 20 slaves himself, while his wife brought 84 slaves as part of her dowry. When Washington passed away, he and his wife owned over 300 slaves. Let's rewind to 1796, 3 years before Washington's death. One of his mixed-race black female slaves, named Ona Judge, escaped to New Hampshire. Within 2 days, Washington's chief aide placed advertisements in local newspapers offering rewards for her return. The following year, Judge's whereabouts were discovered by Washington. He instructed his Secretary of the Treasury, Oliver Wolcott Jr., to pursue her. Wolcott then tasked Joseph Whipple with the mission, and Washington instructed, "If the slave is already a mother, bring the children back to me as slaves." However, this episode regarding the slave named Ona Judge concluded with Whipple letting her escape. He then reported to young Oliver that forcibly bringing her back could provoke abolitionist discontent and incite riots. Upon learning this, Washington was furious. He personally penned a letter to interrogate Whipple. This letter has been preserved to this day in the Huntington Library. Washington spared no effort in pursuing Judge, even writing to his nephew, Burwell Bassett Jr., for assistance in recapturing her as late as August 1799, just 4 months before his death. The Judge family lived in perpetual fear and flight until Washington's death in December 1799. Judge had escaped from Washington's home in Pennsylvania and fled to New Hampshire. According to New Hampshire law, slaves entering the state automatically gained their freedom. However, the U.S. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 by an overwhelming margin of 47-8, allowing slave owners to pursue escaped slaves across state lines. While Washington could have used this law to retrieve Judge through federal courts, he chose covert means to avoid public scrutiny and protect his image. At that time, Washington was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. According to the state's laws, slaves automatically gained their freedom if they resided in Pennsylvania for 6 months. In order to retain his slaves, Washington used a clever argument. "I came to Philadelphia because it is the temporary seat of the federal government, but I am still a Virginian, so I am not obligated to comply with Pennsylvania's laws." However, Pennsylvania's Gradual Abolition Act exempted only the state's congressional members. Only those members who were born in Pennsylvania and owned slaves were not required to free them after 6 months. Other individuals, including federal judicial and executive branch officials, were obligated to follow this law, including the president. To prevent his slaves from learning about this law, Washington strictly prohibited them from reading and writing, keeping them perpetually ignorant. Every 6 months, he rotated his slaves, sending those nearing the end of their term in Pennsylvania to his estate in Virginia, and replacing them with a new batch of slaves in Pennsylvania. However, such rotation was explicitly prohibited by an amendment to Pennsylvania's Gradual Abolition Act of 1788. In essence, Washington knowingly flouted the law. Compared to other slaveholders of his time, Washington provided relatively tolerable treatment to his slaves, but this was largely influenced by his position. For the sake of his reputation and public image, he had to maintain appearances. In his later years, George Washington personally owned 123 slaves, while the others were owned by his wife. He stipulated in his will that upon his death, only one of these slaves could be immediately freed, William Lee. Lee was Washington's aide and a notable figure during the Revolutionary War. The remaining 122 slaves were to be freed only after Martha Washington, his wife, passed away. Essentially, Washington expressed a willingness to free slaves but insisted it wait until both he and his wife had died, fearing it would otherwise impact their quality of life. However, after Washington's death in 1799, Martha Washington freed all slaves under his ownership the following year. This decision wasn't due to a sudden surge of goodwill. Rather, she discovered that the slaves were plotting to hasten her death in hopes of gaining freedom sooner. Thus, it remains unclear whether Washington's initial will was an act of love towards his wife or a calculated move to ensure her early passing for his own burial companionship. As for the slaves owned by Martha Washington, their fate was less fortunate. After her death in 1802, her children divided all these slaves among themselves. Historian Henry Wiensek remarked that Washington's stance on slavery throughout his life remains a mystery, indicating his inconsistent views on the matter. This ambiguity is a common affliction among historians, possessing extensive historical knowledge but lacking insight into human nature and political maneuvering. Washington's ambivalence towards slavery is hardly a mystery. It simply reflects basic self-interest. Ever since he became a public figure, he needed to craft a flawless public image. Thus, in public, he hypocritically championed equality while privately benefiting from slavery. In the Fairfax Resolves of 1774, Washington publicly denounced the slave trade. However, this was mainly because his own slaves were breeding sufficiently, fulfilling his needs without requiring additional purchases. During the Revolutionary War, he did indeed emancipate some slaves, but this was primarily to bolster his military forces by enlisting black soldiers. Only those who joined the military were freed from slavery to serve as cannon fodder. Notably, none of his own slaves were emancipated. Post-revolution, Washington mentioned gradual abolition of slavery. Why gradual? There are various reasons, but could one be that abrupt abolition would mean losing his several hundred slaves? Would he prioritize others' freedom over his own interests? Most people, I believe, would prioritize the latter. Washington's actions and statements on slavery were thus shaped more by personal gain than genuine commitment to equality. In addition, Washington had a specially constructed slave passageway in his Philadelphia presidential mansion, leading from the mansion to the slave quarters adjacent to the stables. Normally, he forbade slaves from using the front entrance, fearing that their presence might damage his reputation if seen by guests. This slave passageway was unearthed by archaeologists from the U.S. National Park Service in 2007. By today's moral standards, what would you call such a person like Washington? A hypocritical scoundrel, wouldn't you agree? Among the first 12 U.S. presidents, except for John Adams and his son, all the others were slaveholding masters. Thomas Jefferson topped the list with over 600 slaves, followed closely by George Washington. The massacre of Native Americans. Apart from owning slaves, Washington also ordered the massacre of a group of Native Americans. His policy towards Native Americans at the time was to buy their land with money. This wasn't out of kindness, but because it minimized his own losses. However, if Native Americans dared not to sell, Washington didn't simply occupy their land. He resorted to brutal means to physically eliminate them. The term he used back then was extirpate, meaning to uproot and completely destroy. In 1779, Washington ordered the destruction of the Iroquois Confederacy. He instructed General John Sullivan to obliterate their settlements, capture as many non-combatants of every age and sex as possible, destroy their crops, and burn their fields to starve them out. In the end, over 40 Iroquois villages were razed to the ground. The American forces engaged in arson, killing, and looting without restraint. Washington's actions resulted in the death of more than half of the Iroquois civilians due to the massacres and the ensuing famine caused by the destruction of their crops and fields. To use the words of American historian Fred Anderson, Washington's conduct approached ethnic cleansing in its severity. Of course, we cannot deny that George Washington, as one of the founding fathers of the United States, made indelible contributions worthy of eternal remembrance. However, no matter how great a political figure may be, they are still ordinary humans bound by historical limitations. As humans, they are not perfect and inevitably have unknown dark sides, as well as personal ambitions and desires. Instead of avoiding or glorifying these aspects, we should confront them. Only then can we better confront history and avoid being easily manipulated by others. And that's a wrap for this episode of the video. I'm Dr. Red Panda. If any of you have your own perspectives or if you think there are any errors in the video, feel free to leave a comment in the discussion section. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. Until next time, take care.